I'm now delighted to introduce you to Dr. Brent Edwards, who shares emerging research on optimizing bone health and preventing fractures in adulthood through targeted physical activities. Dr. Edwards holds the position of Research Excellence Chair and Associate Professor within the Faculty of Kinesiology at the University of Calgary. He also holds joint appointments in the Cumming School of Medicine and the Schulich School of Engineering. As the co-director of the Human Performance Lab, his research is focused on the fundamental mechanisms of fracture and fatigue in bone associated with mechanical loading and therapeutic drugs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Brent Edwards.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you to the Wood Forum, and thank you to the McCaig Institute for the invitation to speak today. So now that Dr. Gable has made you all feel terribly guilty about not participating in enough physical activity as a child, I'm going to tell you that don't stress. There's some things that we can do during adulthood to sort of help at least maintain the bone that we do have, prevent falls from occurring, and in some instances, even build bone, even in older adulthood. Dr. Gable touched on the important mechanical role that bone plays, and so I'm just going to reiterate that. It protects our internal organs. It provides the body its basic shape. It facilitates movement. That's one of the most important things that it do, right? It serves as a location for our muscles to attach and pull, and that's the only way that we can move. And then it provides a framework for support. I love this image here. So this is an illustration drawn by Andreas Vesalius, who's often regarded as the godfather of modern anatomy. And I love this image because the skeleton just looks like he's in complete anguish. And I like to think it's because of the large mechanical loads that it has to endure throughout the lifespan. Because of these large mechanical loads, unfortunately, sometimes bones crack or they break, right? And there's different types of fractures. There's what we call a traumatic fracture, and this is going to be caused by, acute, high-energy trauma. These are your fractures that happen because you're skiing or you're in a car accident. Then we have fragility fractures, sometimes called pathological fractures. And these are fractures that are caused by minimal trauma in a weak or a pathological or a diseased state of bone. This is your fall from standing height or lower in an older adult. And then we have something called a stress fracture. In older adults, we call them insufficiency fractures. And these are overuse injuries that happen, and they're caused by the accumulation of little itty-bitty micro-trauma that we get inside our bones when we participate in repetitive, cumulative bouts of physical activity. We can get fractures that way. It's kind of akin to the way sometimes, you take a paper clip and you can work it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until it breaks. That's kind of what happens with a stress fracture. A similar mechanism. We can't do a lot, to minimize our chances of these traumatic fractures. We can drive safer, a little bit more defensively. We can pick our activities a little bit wiser. But it's really these two types of fractures, these pathological fractures and these stress fractures, so that we can do things to avoid. Okay, on the simplest sense of a fracture, it really only depends on two things. It's this biomechanical event that only happens when the applied load or the force that's applied to the bone exceeds the bone's strength. It's as simple as that. Force, and if there's no force, then the bone doesn't break. And so what do we mean when we talk about the applied load? Well, what's the applied load dependent on? It's dependent on the activity. Did you fall from standing height? Did you fall while you were running? This is going to change the load. Were you walking the dog and the leash got wrapped around your legs, which happens all the time? You fall down. That's going to change the applied load. What kind of surface are you walking on? Are you going to fall on ice? Are you falling on the grass? That can change. What about your response time? How quickly can you react to a fall? Can you do something? Can you take a step to prevent that fall from occurring so there's no applied load to the bone at all, right? This is what we mean when we talk about the applied load. The other thing that, that we're very interested in is bone strength. And bone strength is dependent, again, on multiple different things. Your bone mass, your bone density, the structure, the size, the geometry, and then the material. What's the quality of the building blocks of the bone material that the bone is made of? These are all important things. And so we can intervene to prevent a fracture essentially through both of these pathways. Try to minimize those loads, or we can try to improve our bone strength. There's really 3 rules, especially when it comes to adulthood. There's really 3 rules that are very important to follow when we're worried about adapting our bones, improving our bone strength, or even maintaining the bone strength that we do have. And the first rule is that the load that the bone is exposed to, it has to be dynamic. It can't be static. Standing, this is not a bone building exercise, okay? Bone likes to be, as Dr. Gable put it, squished, okay? It likes to be squished through heavy, dynamic, impulsive type of loading. It lives for that. One of the cool things about bone is that you don't need to load it a lot to reap the benefits of physical activity. So only a short duration of loading is necessary because bone becomes, in fact, less responsive to repetitive loading over time. So you really don't have to participate in a lot of physical activity as long as it's dynamic and impulsive and it squishes the bones in order to reap the benefits of physical activity. And then finally, bone cells, they accommodate to the customary load. So you need to change it up. It likes variable loading. It likes it when you increase the loading magnitude. If you go to the gym and you do the same bicep curl every day, day in and day out, and you do the same number of repetitions, you do the same weight, at some point your muscle's gonna say, yeah, I'm used to this. I can do this. You're not gonna get that muscle atrophy, and bone is the same way. Okay, for a long time, we thought, you can't build bone in older adults through exercise, but that's not really true, especially if you follow these 3 rules of adaptation. This is a study published in 2018 in the top bone journal in the field, and it was the #1 downloaded study in this journal in that year. What they did was they took postmenopausal females around 65 years of age, all with low bone mineral density. So they were either osteopenic or osteoporotic, and they randomized them to 2 different loading groups. You're going to participate in either high-intensity resistance and impact training, high resistance training, 80 to 85% of your of what we call your 1-rep maximum ability, and then impact training. They're dropping from bars onto the ground, okay? So heavy, sort of impulsive type of loading. Or you get randomized to a low-intensity exercise program. Low-intensity exercise program means you're at home and you're just, you're working against your body weight. You're doing squats. But they only did this program for 8 months and only 2 days per week. The bone doesn't need a lot of it, right? Just 2 days per week. What they found was that the women participating in the high-intensity training had superior gains in bone mass, in fact, significant improvements in bone mass, improvements to bone structure, and nearly every single measurement of physical function. So lower extremity strength, lumbar spine strength, and then they had, this is time to up and go. So these are measurements of people sitting down in a chair. How fast can you get up? How fast can you walk 10 meters? And these kinds of things. All of these metrics of physical function went up, and they found nearly 4% higher bone mineral density at the spine, 2% higher bone mineral density at the hip. These are the kind of effects that you would expect from taking osteoporosis drug therapies. 30% higher muscle strength. Now, this was intensive physical activity done under very strict supervision of healthcare professionals. If you are wanting to start doing physical activity to promote your bone health, then I think the first place that I would start is with the new Osteoporosis Canada guidelines. Okay, so you go to Google Osteoporosis Canada, exercise, and you'll find this, what was just released, Too Fit to Fracture, the new Osteoporosis Canada guidelines. And on there, they've got these great recommendations for what you can do to maintain your bone health and maybe just as importantly, or perhaps more importantly, minimize your risk for falling. Remember, we want to minimize the applied load. What do they recommend? They recommend strength training only 2 days per week. Okay? And this will keep you strong and fit, and it'll help build bone. Balance exercises every day. Walking on your toes, walking on your heels, yoga, tai chi. This will help prevent falls. Postural awareness, working on good posture while you're sitting down or while you're standing. This minimizes loads on the spine. That's why that's important. But then they also recommend at least 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous type of aerobic weight-bearing exercise. You're walking, you're jogging, you're running if you can, you're dancing, and this is going to improve your overall health. And when they say moderate to vigorous type of exercise, we're talking about the type of exercise where you can still carry a conversation maybe with your friend, but just barely, okay? Just barely. You're losing your breath a bit. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about something that I really, really love. Because if you are going to take on a new aerobic weight-bearing activity, like walking, like running, like jogging, and you do have to think about overuse injuries, especially if you're not accustomed to participating in a lot of aerobic weight-bearing activity. And one of those overuse injuries that we need to talk about is what's called a stress fracture, what I alluded to earlier. So what is a stress fracture? This is a type of overuse injury that occurs, and it happens because repetitive loads, when applied to the skeletal system, such as those that you get during walking and running, they cause microtrauma in the bone. Small little cracks that your eyes can't see. We're all standing and sitting and walking on cracks in our bones right now. This is a cross-section of bone. In adulthood, bone is comprised of these cylindrical-like structures, which we call osteons, the building block of bone. But when we do repetitive exercise, we get these tiny little cracks that kind of form in between our osteons. And it's not all bad. We all have it. And some even think that those cracks are important for bone adaptation because those cracks can serve as a stimulus for a new bone remodeling unit or a new osteon to form. But if you participate in too much physical activity and you don't allow your body enough rest for the bone remodeling process to occur, then you can get these pesky little things that we call stress fractures. And a lot of them, most of them, they're not threatening, they're not serious, but they're going to put you out for 12 weeks. And you don't want to have to do that. But some are serious. Some are serious depending on where they occur, and they do require surgical fixation. So if you are going to take up a new running regimen or walking regimen, what are some things that you can do to prevent these stress fractures? Probably the most important thing that you can do is you can prioritize volume over intensity, okay? If you start to walk or you start to run, focus on increasing your distance before you start focusing on increasing your speed. And this is because the magnitude of loading, when you increase the magnitude of loading, it starts to increase your risk for stress fracture in this very nonlinear fashion. You get rapid changes in stress fracture risk with changes in loading intensity. But when you focus on distance training first, or you increase your distance, then the risk only increases linearly in a one-to-one fashion. So focus on increasing the volume before you work on the intensity. Another thing that you can do is you can take shorter strides. Females are at a higher risk of stress fracture than males, and this is particularly true in military recruits. And one of the things that the American and the British military started observing is that, well, the women, on average, are of shorter stature than the males. And they noticed that they were essentially trying to keep pace with the males during marching and other type of, ambulatory exercises. And so what did the militaries do? The American and the British militaries, they put a limit on how long strides could be taken during marching exercises, or they actually had the females start to set the pace. And when they had the females start to set the pace during marching exercises, the risk of stress fractures went way down. And that's because when you are overstriding, you're putting an increased load on your skeletal system. So if you're walking, if you're running with a taller person, with a taller partner, then maybe have the shorter person set the pace. Or work on just decreasing your stride length and increasing your cadence. That'll have added cardiovascular benefits as well. And then finally, maybe one of the other important things that you can do is pick comfortable shoes. There was a great study in the military where they had the military cadets, they could select from 5 or 6 different types of shoes to do all their physical activity in. And they were all of different constructions, different cushioning, different materials. And what they found was that in the individuals that were able to select their own shoe, to select the one that was most comfortable to them, that they had a significantly lower incidence of stress fracture, a significantly lower incidence of pain. And this is a very subject-specific kind of response because they all picked different shoes that was comfortable to them, okay? And then some of our research has shown, when you switch acutely from something like a nice cushioned walking or running shoe, to something that's more minimalistic, like a barefoot type of shoe, and you really put a lot of load on those bones, and if you don't allow time for those bones to adapt, then your risk of fracture shoots way up. So again, if you are switching to a new, different type of footwear that maybe is less comfortable to you, focus on increasing that volume instead of intensity. Okay, so that's my time. I'm just going to summarize by saying that, fracture in the simplest of sense depends on just 2 things: the applied load and the bone strength. And the great thing about exercise and physical activity and staying mobile and moving is that we can prevent fractures through both of these pathways. It gives us 2 ways to intervene. And then finally, your risk of stress fracture may be reduced. That's the scientist in me hedging a little bit. May be reduced with some simple training rules, gait modifications, and footwear selection. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Amazing. Wow. Thank you, Dr. Edwards. That's really helpful, especially the Osteoporosis Canada guidelines and about the shoe, the footwear. So important.